Okay, should we do one more stand up, stretch, breathe? Home stretch. Are you having fun? Is this interesting? So, just one thing to canoodle in your book. After Matthew is done at about 3:30 or so, we're just going to ask 2 questions. So if you can start thinking about it, just to get feedback on kind of where we go from here, is 1, why did you come, right? Like to know. And then where do you think we should go next? You know, we have the courses and we have dialogues, but if you had a dream, because this was a dream, like how to help, this is a co-creation process. So if over the next 2 hours, you can just think about that. We'd love to take 15 or 20 minutes or so, just to get your feedback and talk about it. Also, we'd love your written feedback because, you know, Jonathan is a key part of that and he's our quant jock here. But you'll see the QR code in the back of the program. If you could fill it out to get your feedback, what worked, what didn't, what did you like, what did you not like, how could we make it better, that would be awesome as well. And the third piece is Teton Valley Books, which we're so grateful to. Yay to local bookstores, right? So Amy has been so sweet, so busy, and she's come here. Everybody has books. I even wrote a book that I tell nobody about, but I put it out there. Someday I'll get the guts to market it. Anyway, everybody after at 4 o'clock or whenever we're done, 3:45, will be out there and we'll give them pens if you want to buy anybody's book and have it autographed. So just to know that. So. You can stay standing or you can sit down now. It's up to you. So huge thanks to Nick and Betsy and Carly and Andrew and Chris and Christine for this morning. Just thank you. And now we're going to have a little bit of fun, because one thing that's also been shown to be true in all of these frameworks is we all have patterns. And while we're all really unique, and we are, our uniqueness often falls into patterns, right? And for a lot of people here and leaders, there's all sorts of tests or evaluations out there, you know, in the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or Caliper or whatever. And they're, you know, somewhat interesting to help us understand ourselves and understand other people. But my question is, how many people like took some kind of like mythology class somewhere in school? Like, and you know, we hear a lot about especially Greek mythology, but there's many mythologies. And like the question is, what does it feel like if I could be like Athena? Like, who would Athena be in this? Or if, you know, maybe it's a Zeus day. Or do I have a pattern or archetype that actually fits in some of those stories? And maybe how can I expand that and shift those? Well, a few years ago, I was honored enough to meet Craig Chalquist. And truly, I think he knows more about mythology over the last 5,000 years across the globe, and more stories of all of those myths than anyone I've ever met. And it's really fascinating to be able to say, how does that help us? How can we shift that world we live in? Because purpose and values are huge. But what are those underlying stories, those underlying myths, those underlying biases that we might not even know until we choose to become conscious of them and bring them to light? And then how can we shift them? So I'm really honored to invite Craig to help us think about how do we restore leadership. So thank you.
All right, hello everybody. So what I wanted to do to start off with is give you a little bit of a view of our path forward over the next 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to do a panel, 2 more local leaders to talk to. So what I'd like to do is talk about storying and leadership. And I know there's a lot going on right now about research into storytelling and things like that. I brought a little science with me, but we're going to go, I think, a bit deeper than that and talk about some of these basic story patterns that show up a lot for us as leaders. So we'll see a little bit about what that looks like. And then after that, I want to look at some of the really old stories, which here we call them myths. Other countries call them the traditional tales or the old tales or what have you, and see if there's something more to them, and I think there will be, to the wisdom that they carry that applies across time periods, because the same human situations for leaders and for everybody recur over time, over and over again. So we'll have a glance at that. And then I coined this word loreology to try to figure out what I do. And I've worn different hats professionally, but none of them ever fit quite right. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that because it's what I actually do professionally now. And it has to do with work with story. So we'll see what that looks like. And then from there, we'll go into the importance of enchantment and why that matters to us as leaders. We'll have a look at that. And finally, I want to mention 3 powers of enchanted leadership, and that's what we'll finish with. So that's where we're heading. So a little bit about me. Had to borrow that from the post office, that picture over there. So help me remember to bring it back when I'm done. But I wanted to just mention a couple of things because they're directly relevant to what we're doing here. So in terms of, let's see here. So depth psychology, we're going to be doing some of that today. When I say sometimes that I'm a depth psychologist, people hear that as death psychologist. So I wanted to make sure to spell it right on my own slide. But it has to do with looking at symbolism, how the unconscious speaks to us, what our dreams might be trying to tell us. There's a lot of mythology in depth psychology. So we'll have a look at that as we go and see what we can learn from that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I don't work as a psychotherapist anymore. I did on and off for about 9 years. And during that time, in I guess about year 2, so when I was an intern, I took an intern position working with men who had all committed violent crimes, anywhere from assault and battery to murder. And then they went to jail or prison. They did their time. They came out, and they were mandated by the courts to do a year of therapy with us. In California, which is where I'm from, you have to train for a year to do that kind of work because it's fairly risky compared to ordinary therapy work for obvious reasons. So I did that on and off for 6 years, usually 3 times a week. I went to court every week on behalf of the men in my programs when I learned to lead the programs. And court was the boring part in some ways, but the exciting part for me was I started teaching the men in my programs just kind of on a whim, the hero's journey, which Joseph Campbell has explicated and Hollywood now got a hold of, more or less. So I'm mentioning this because that taught me a little bit more about the power of myth to make an actual difference to how people live. And as a group leader, I was able to step into that a little bit and use different figures from mythology to help the men understand that they had different options than the ones that they were picking, which of course were disastrous for them as well as their victims. So that's where some of this comes from too. Sandy asked a good question earlier. I wanted to ask all of you, how many of you who had one of those mythology classes that she asked about found them to be terribly boring? And I'll raise my hand because I did. Well, that's great. I'm actually heartened by the fact that I don't see anybody else's hand up. Anybody up there? No? That's great that I'm the only one because mine was so boring. I had it in, I guess it was middle school now that I think of it, and I couldn't see what the relevance was. So by studying depth psychology and using it in my programs, I started to get an understanding. So we'll go into that a little bit as we move forward. So let's start with storying leadership. One of the things I'll do a few times with you is go through a little bit of etymology very briefly, and the reason is that oftentimes the roots of words have a story, and sometimes it's a mythic story. In this case, if we look at lead as a verb, so to guide and to travel, it fits nicely with what we were hearing earlier from the other presenters, and I really like to go forth, that there's something exploratory about that. But then when we look at that word as a noun, of course it's a different word in English, led, and to wait, or to wait and to plummet. And I think we've all had the experience of that sort of leadership that's not inspiring. And a key takeaway, which I'll mention again later in this presentation, is that what fires me up and gives me passion is leadership that inspires. And I know there's been a lot of talk about that, but I want to go a little bit more below the surface when we get into this. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And the reason, so now I'm looking at it through a mythological lens, the reason I refer to it as heroic leadership is because it tends to be based on that model, especially in the States. We love the hero. And whenever anyone does something decent for somebody else and it gets into the news, it's all about this person's the town hero now, which is fine to a point. But when you read about actual heroes through the mythologies around the world, one of the things that is very clear to these storytellers is that heroes are very dangerous people. When you read about Gilgamesh or Heracles, and afterwards, or Cuchulainn from the Irish stories, it's like, wow, these people were really out of control. So, I mean, they tore up forests, they burned themselves up. I mean, it's like, I don't think I want to emulate this, you know? So, hero, it has a shadow side. It has a tough side to it. And this is some of what we see when we lead, usually unconsciously, from kind of a heroic position. I'm thinking of Betsy's term that she used earlier, command and control style of leadership, right? And when I translate that mythically, I tend to think of that as kind of the shadow side of heroic leadership. And we've all known people who did this. Some of us, including me, have done it ourselves. But top down, I'm the one who decides, not collaborative. That's a shadow side of all this. It's codependent, and what I mean by this, and by the way, I teach a class on codependency online for a group called Young Platform because it's such a huge problem, but it reinforces other people's dependency. It's a leadership style that says, I'm the one who's important, depend on me, which makes people weak. Micromanaging, we all know what that is. I've quit 3 different jobs because I had micromanaging bosses. And I already talked to non-collaborative, lack of mentoring, obviously, right? If you're the one who matters the most, why should you mentor other people? And lack of transparency. There was a school I worked at, I was second in charge, so my title was associate provost, and I was acting president when the president visited China. And I don't know how many times I told him when we would discuss policy or something would come up in terms of running the school, and he would say, well, this affects faculty and other administrators and blah, 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 and we've got to think about this. And I would be like, just tell them, include them in the conversation. And invariably they'd find out later and be mad, understandably, and trust just plummets when you do that kind of leadership. So that's why that's on the list. And then a limited view of consequences. We're good in this culture at thinking in the linear, not so good at thinking in the round. Thinking ecologically is one way of talking about it. That when you affect this over here, 3 other things over here that don't seem connected are, right? So a question, how do we get to leadership that's wise, but also how can we do it in a way that lets us understand the story of what that actually looks like? And so let's look at some of these old stories. We have limited time, so I can't actually be a storyteller and go through one of them, but I can touch on them a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do next. So before I do that, a little bit about why story matters. The more I study psychology, which I've been doing since college, back in the Pleistocene, the more the more I always go back to story as a basic explanation for how the psyche works, how we work, how the mind works. Some people say we're the hero in our own story. Sometimes we are. I prefer to say protagonist, but whatever. It's a frame of orientation, and it tends to organize information, including different kinds of quantitative data. When we hear about numbers and statistics, and we heard some really good ones yesterday that really matter, what we also got to hear is, what does this mean for you as a community? What is the bigger story behind these numbers? And that's where they really land. So we not only need to know what the facts mean, we need to understand what the story is underneath the facts, and then it makes sense to us. It's context, right? And I listed a couple of other things. Story involves more of the brain. It brings the heart in. We heard about that earlier. Sometimes it's a good distance from tough issues. There's cultures where somebody's behaving in a way that's inappropriate in a particular cultural group, And oftentimes the elder members of the culture will say, you know, this reminds me of a time when, and they'll say something out of their deep cultural lore, and they feel that this is less shaming than calling people out, especially in a group, right? So they'll handle it that way. So sometimes telling stories is a way of stepping back a little bit and getting a better sense of what's actually confronting us that's difficult. And stories, too, are a common ground in many ways. I'll show you some science here in a second. But also I wanted to mention, too, that stories have a way of pulling you in. Oftentimes when we want to change the behavior of a community, or even our own behavior, we push, right? Shoulds, oughts, we have to do it this way, we have to oppose this, we have to get this kind of activism going, and that has its place. But for stubborn people like me, it's more appealing to show me how it could be, how things actually could look if we did it right. And then I'm on board, right? I went to Sunday school until I went to college. I had all kinds of training, as some of you probably did, in what we shouldn't do and what's bad and sinful or whatever it is, right? And so a lot of us have this instinctive opposition to being told what to do, whether we have that kind of background or not. But when you tell a story, including a story of a possible future where we can all belong, there's something compelling about that that moves people forward in a way that shoulds and oughts don't. So here's a little bit of that science I mentioned. Stories are great for memory. Oftentimes, it's the anecdotes that we remember. When we hear a lecture, when we hear a debate, whatever it is, they create empathy. Thinking of PJ Manny, she has a group in Facebook called The New Mythos. She's a best-selling science fiction author, and she likes to call storytelling an empathy engine, which is nice. I think that's right. And brain behavior in different people who see the same movie tends to synchronize, so they're wonderful that way. I mentioned the other one earlier. We tend to be characters to ourselves in our own life story, however we understand that. And also, this tends to work across languages and cultural barriers, as this indicates up here. If you want to know more about this, by the way, so email me and or just get a hold of me, and I'll send you this slideshow. I've put more text on these slides than I usually do, and if my students did that, I'd get after them. But the reason I did that is I want you to have this afterwards. So now, in terms of stories, the ones that interest me, maybe even more than myth, are the ones we tell ourselves, not only personally, but also collectively. The stories by which we make sense of who we are, what we're doing, in this conference context, what our leadership role is, how we do leadership, things like that. And one of the ways you know a story isn't working is you start seeing not just breakdowns, but absurdities. And I'm drawing a little bit on my family systems training here. My teachers always told me, look for the interactions in families that are not only undesirable, but they happen every single time, right? So Thanksgiving's a big trigger holiday for a lot of people. Well, actually, I shouldn't ask you, that's personal, but but I will say it is, or it was in my family, and that was the rowdy holiday where everybody fought at the table, and my mom tried to be the peacemaker, and my dad was my dad, and you know. So at a family systems level, when you have interactions like that they keep recurring but nobody's happy, they indicate a problem. They indicate a stuck story. In this case, the family story, and it's not spoken outward. It's outwardly. It's unarticulated, but it's potent. And sometimes the stories that aren't told are the powerful ones. So of these silly images I put up here, all of which indicate some kind of a cultural breakdown, my favorite at the moment is open box before eating pizza. I can't tell you how many pieces of cardboard I picked out of my teeth over the years trying to get to the pepperoni before I finally read that and went, oh, that's how you do it. So on a bit of a more serious note here, so I think a lot of us have heard about the disaster that happened last year. We lost a submersible called Titan. So I wanted to bring this up as kind of an extreme example of when a collective story goes wrong, but I wanted to bring in myth too to show you how this looks through a mythic lens. So, and this, by the way, is not about things we should or shouldn't have done or who's to blame or any of that. I'm looking at this as a cultural issue, right, and a mythological one as well. So on one level, the eerie, and people have written about this, including me, the eerie coincidences of the loss of these two vessels. So all kinds of safety issues. People in the Titan, in the submersible, warned in advance, we've got the hull might have problems, we need to test it more. No. There were people at the last minute, in both cases, who just had this funny feeling that they couldn't name, that maybe I shouldn't be on this trip. And they lived, right? So that happened both times. Risking passengers in an experimental voyage is the same in both cases. So that's one level of it. Normally, we dismiss this as coincidence. That's our rational kind of head way of thinking about this. It's a coincidence. And maybe it is. But if we look at it through the lens of myth, it starts to acquire maybe a different, flavor or dimension or something like that. And so the particular myth I'm thinking about involves two races of gods. The first are the Titans. So the Titans are the old race of gods. They are the ones that have been around for a while and their time is kind of up. So they are replaced by the Olympians. And I think it's important to remember, too, that the Olympians, so that's Zeus and Hera and Athena and all of them, they were blessed by Gaia. So they had the buy-in of Earth, if you want to think of it that way. So the Olympians are the newer race of gods. The old ones didn't go quietly. And one other thing to think about the Titans is that they were gigantic beings, huge inflated beings, right, who were very sure of themselves. So there was a battle both in heaven and on earth. The Olympians won, and the Titans, when they lost, most of them were locked up in boxes in the deepest part of the Greek underworld, which in our world is exactly where these two vessels, both named after Titans, ended up. So this is what I mean by a mythic story that replays. And I think this is one of the relevances of myth and of mythic motifs and characters. They don't stay in the myth books. They recur in tragic events. They show up in our dreams. They happen in interactions between all of us. There's corporate myths. There's myths in the school that I work in, all the schools I've worked in. They're all over the place. There's something called personal myths, too, that I won't go into now, but I'll say something about it at the very end, though. So the lesson that could be learned from this, well, there's many different ones, but I always kind of sum it up as pride goeth before a fall, right? If we're in too much of a hurry and not willing to slow down and actually reflect on what we're doing, it can be disastrous. And then the myth replays itself in its most literal form. But the other side of the story, where things went right, is that the Titanic had a sister ship, and that would be the Olympic. So the Olympic designers learned some lessons from what happened to the other ship. And they added lifeboats, they built up bulkheads, they did all kinds of work. And some of that, interestingly, started even before the Titanic disaster. If I remember correctly, the Olympic's actually the older ship. So nothing happened to that one, except it had a crash at one point, I forget the year, and it caved in part of the bow, but there was no loss of life. The ship was able to get back to port, and it was repaired, and then it had a career after that. So interesting difference. Here's an open question. What would happen if we knew enough mythology to ask how this comes into the world of finance? Because it's full of mythic images, right? We have the invisible hand. That one's been around for a while. We have witching hours, unicorns, castles in the air, angel investors, bulls and bears. There's all this mythological language in business. I don't know what that means, but it could indicate some interesting collective psychology that's at work. So that would be something to explore, I think. I wrote a book called Myths Among Us because I needed something for my graduate students beyond what I was already giving them that involved myths from many different cultures rather than just the Greeks and Romans. So there's something in there about this. But that's one that's a question for me. Like, what does that mean, you know? And if we think of myth as collective psychology, you know, what's the enchantment? What's the magic? What's even the spiritual force in finance that perhaps we're not fully conscious of? I don't know. There's myths in technology. That figure sitting on the cloud up there always reminds me of when I transitioned to Apple some years ago. I was running my own little micro-publishing business, and I was using Microsoft for a while, and it kept crashing on my publishing program. So I went, I've had enough of this blue screen of death stuff. So I went to the Apple store, and I felt like I was walking into a spaceship. It was kind of cool. And so at one point, this was years and years ago, I asked, well, what about things like antivirus software and all that, you know? And the salesperson in the store said, oh, you don't have to worry about that. And he actually did this. He said, it's all in the cloud. And he went, and seeing this, I looked up. I was like, I don't know what I expected to see, but very mythic. Another piece to this is artificial intelligence there at the bottom. There's stories about autonomous beings, if I can speak properly, that go back to ancient Egypt. And all in many different cultures. There's a great series of stories about the golem from Jewish mythology. There are these powerful beings that magical rabbis could create, but the thing about a golem is it does exactly what it's told. So there's these kind of humorous stories where a rabbi creates a golem and says, go do this, and it does it exactly like it's told, right? So that's a powerful algorithm. So let's switch a little bit and talk about this term I came up with. And the reason I have a picture of Sherlock Holmes up there is that he sort of inspired it. I got in some trouble when I was younger and set my high school on fire. And then I'm adopted, and I met my birth father years later, and he said, what kind of trouble did you get into? And I told him. And he goes, yeah, our ancestors burned Rome to the ground. I was like, that's way more intense than my school. So I was in a fight with this bully. I knocked him out at lunchtime, and then I lit his locker on fire, and it spread a little bit along one wall. But fortunately, they put it out in time, so instead of going to jail, I just went to continuation school, which was kind of fun, actually. And I did the lessons in advance, and I spent most of the semester reading Sherlock Holmes stories for the very first time. And the part that's kind of stayed with me is when he and Watson first meet, and Watson's trying to figure out what Holmes does for a living, and Holmes finally tells him, and he goes, I'm a consulting detective. And Watson says, what in the world is that? And he says, well, I have some knowledge that I've accumulated about how crime works and who commits it. And what I do is, here at 221B Baker Street, specialists and Scotland Yard and people like that visit me, they consult me, I get my fee, and then I solve the case, right? And every now and then I have to go out and actually look at things and, you know, with the magnifying glass and all that. But usually I can just do it based on knowing how all this works, right? And I thought, what a cool job that would be. So years later, when I was trying to think, you know, am I primarily a depth psychologist or an eco-psychologist? I have an ecological background as well. What is it I should think of myself as? And this is the word that came up. Because whatever kind of work I do, at school, in the corporate world as a consultant, whatever it is, it always has to do with this, exploring what I call keystone stories. So just as in ecology, there are keystone species. We were hearing about wolves on our tour that some of the presenters took a few days ago. When you remove a keystone species, it affects everything in the ecosystem, even the land itself. And in the same way, there are certain powerful stories that we tell ourselves that influence our values, our goals, how we see things, how we view ourselves, our leadership style, and what have you. So I like to work with those stories. I look for where they're stuck, and it's not just a matter of substituting a new story for an old one, because, you know, as irritating people like Freud pointed out, when you try to do that, the old story tends to come with you. You know, how many times, well, actually, I'm remembering a client that I had one time during my psychotherapy days who, she kept getting into relationships with the same awful dynamic in it. And then she came in once and just frustrated, and she said, you know what, this guy I'm with right now is more controlling than the last one. I'm regressing. And I said, no, you're getting ready to stop this. That relationship that you're in right now is like a funhouse mirror. It's showing you what the problem is in gigantic dimensions. It means you're getting ready to get beyond this, right? So I like doing that kind of work. I don't do therapy anymore, but I do work with some individuals. There's a colonel right now who's working on her dissertation. It's a fascinating topic. It has to do with the psychology of money. And specifically, why is it that healers, including psychotherapists, have such a hard time talking about money with their clients, and how can we get past this? So it's not just dumping the old story out of the air and hoping it's not going to show up again, which it does, but it's more about honoring what the old story did for us while it was still necessary, and then being able to move beyond it into either a wider version of the old story or then, at that point, into a newer one. So at work, these are some of the questions I ask at work or around the issue of work. What life cycle transition is at hand? I think businesses of any size go through something similar to what individuals and families go through. I'm so grateful for my family therapy training, even though I don't do family therapy anymore. We talked about the family life cycle and how there are certain key events like people dying in the family, people being born in the family, kids moving out, stuff like that. And they work like developmental stages in the lives of individuals. So likewise, businesses do that. When you're new, that's one phase. When you get a firm sense of what your mission and vision and purpose are, that's another phase, and so on. When you change your operation, thinking of Ray Anderson and Interface. So he made the first modular carpets and did well at it. And then in 1995, he decided that he needed the operation to be fully sustainable. So he retooled everything, he and his team. And I think over a 12-year stretch, if I remember his TED Talk correctly, by doing that, by actually becoming out in the open with his idealism and wanting to protect the planet, I think he said his sales increased 2/3, and what was the other number? Profit doubled over a 12-year period, something like that. So that leads us to the next one. What paradigm, what story needs to shift? Because these keystone stories, or myths if we want to put it that way, are like miniature worldviews. So if we're stuck in seeing what we're doing in one way, how can we shift that? What needs to shift? How might the system resist change? That's a whole other presentation. And some of us have run into this already. How has the old one served us, and how can we reimagine the new one? So let's have some specific examples. So for a while, I was the chair of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And the program, roughly 45 to 50 years ago, it got going because there was a group of Western psychologists who were talking to people who had participated in wisdom traditions and practices from India. And they thought, wouldn't it be neat if we built a program around this conversation so that you could learn things like mindfulness meditation, and this is 40 to 50 years ago. You could learn all these great things that come out of those traditions, those ancient traditions from India, yoga and other things, and then put them into conversation with psychology and see what kinds of new knowledge and practice come out of that. So I asked the people in my program if we were really stepping up to this mission anymore, because we had a group of, I think it was 6 core faculty, all white, nobody who had spent, well, there were a few people who had spent some time in India, But it's, on the one hand, there's the name and the image, East-West psychology, and then there's us, right? So it's like, this feels kind of funny, you know? So where do we want to go with that? So an obvious consideration would be, let's hire more faculty of color and with different experience from ours. But there was a lot of resistance to that. There were 2 faculty in particular who had been in the program for decades, and they didn't like this idea. So I asked everybody to imagine what kind of an image, what kind of an archetype really kind of sums up our program. You know, if you think of our program that way, what is it? And so one of the ones that kept coming up over and over, even in people's dreams, was a bridge. And so I said, okay, that's what we were. But in terms of where we need to go and what we need to do, what do we want to be? And we had been adding other wisdom tradition teachings from different cultures, so it wasn't just Southeast Asia anymore. We were adding, we also added ecopsychology. I brought that piece, other disciplines, other practices and knowledge areas, and we decided, well, not decided, we kind of discovered at one point that we were actually more like a hub, connecting all these different knowledge and practice areas. So knowing how this felt, and we could feel the change of images, helped us move things forward. So if you look us up now, what you'll see is that the department is now led by a man who grew up in India. We have core faculty, I shouldn't say we because I don't work there anymore, but there's on the core faculty is a woman who's a Chinese scholar who grew up in China. There's a man from South America who's an expert on ecopsychology. There's all kinds of plurality and diversity and different voices that weren't there before. And the program's the better for it. The students love it. Their enrollment's really high compared to what it used to be. So that might be one example of using this to make a little bit of change at work. I should mention too, in terms of management styles, when I think about what I mentioned earlier in terms of top-down heroic management, so some of these huge figures, Hercules, Kronos is, he's Saturn. He's famous for being kind of a distant father figure who one day started eating some of the other gods who were his children. So, I mean, how many people have worked in a place where it seems like the higher-ups are eating everybody? They're eating, well, there's at least one hand. I know I have. You know, they're eating the vitality, the ideas. Yeah, raise your hand if you know this, you know. Right? It's horrible. So you walk out of the place at the end of the day, and you have, you know, half the energy is when you walked in, right? So those are not leadership styles to recommend. But there's so many different examples. There's tricksters. There's people who lead from that position. There's people who are more nurturing, more like Gaia, for instance, and that's their leadership style. That's where they're comfortable. Lots of possibilities. There's a wonderful magician who's one of my favorite hero alternatives. He appears in Welsh and Irish myth. The Welsh call him Manawydan, and he has a heroic friend who continually gets into trouble because he's impulsive, like a lot of hero figures are in myth. And Manawydan solves problems by being patient, reflective, and looking under the hood at what's going on to see what it actually means. So he's a good model for some of us. There's a career change I wanted to mention. I've actually lumped a bunch of these together. There have been people I've worked with over the years who weren't happy with what they were doing, and they got more in touch with the mythic roots. One said, we talked about Hera a little bit, she tends to be kind of a fierce mother, or a dark mother figure, very controlling, right? I have to know exactly what's going on. And I'm thinking of someone in particular who held that position in a group and just was unhappy with her job. And so she ended up going somewhere else, but doing similar job responsibilities. She was a marketer, but she did it in a much lighter way, and that was more nurturing, much more like Gaia. And she was much happier with that too. So in terms of authenticity, a question to ask is, from a mythic standpoint, when I think about the characters of myth I know about, or even when I read fiction, who appeals to me? Who can I resonate with emotionally? So in public, there's a term that you might want to look up. enchantivism is not an alternative to activism, but enchantivism has to do with telling stories that are bigger than the ruptures that cause them. Stories about how we could be together, how things could be, right? So I think of examples, for instance, like Nichelle Nichols showing up in, I'll use the Star Trek since we're on that track a little bit, showing up in the 60s in that TV show and getting to the point where she was going to quit because they didn't do anything with her. She was just opening and closing the hailing frequencies. And then Martin Luther King had a conversation with her and said, we need visions of black people on the bridge of that ship in the future. You have to stay there. And she did. And she did more with the part as well. So that would be an example of enchantivism, leading through enchantment and inspiration. So this is the last piece. Let's see, I'm looking at the time here. The last piece I wanted to get into, let's see here. So when you think about when you felt enchanted and in awe, for some of us, these are rare occasions, but when you look across cultures, for a lot of people, they're actually normal. They're actually a state that people go in and out of sometimes daily. Enchantment is a sign, therefore, of being well, being integrated, being healthy. And I'm thinking, too, of Kennedy, right? We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do these other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Enchantment is an enormous motivator. And to say enchant, actually, if you look at the etymology of that, it means to be inside a song. So I have a little picture down there of a guy diving out of the sky. That was, I always get the date wrong. I think it's March 20, 1961, cover of Sports Illustrated. That's my birth father. And reminding me of Icarus, the guy with wings. He came to a better end, actually, but so because he loved what he did. My father was a Marine, and when that ended, he thought, what can I do for a living? And then he kept jumping out of the sky, and then he taught other people how to do it. He was also an inter-island pilot in Hawaii, so he found his bliss. So I wanted to address this too. Let me check in. Let's see. I want to go over a couple of minutes just because we started a couple of minutes late. Is that okay? Okay. I promise I'll wrap it up pretty quick here. So I played around with Maslow's pyramid a little because I wanted to give it kind of an ecological slant. But in terms of this question, right, this is really important. Yes, of course you have to make payroll. You have to get the stuff done that needs to get done. No question about it. But that second bullet, to make space for my own re-inspiration. The thing about inspiration, if we call it that rather than enchantment, is that it's contagious. It tends to spread. I discovered about myself years ago that I'm actually really good at kind of selling the programs that I'm in, that I teach in, that I direct, just by talking about why I love to teach what I teach. Who knew? So when we do that, we draw people in. As leaders, we get people to follow us. And the question came up earlier about how do you make people follow you, and of course you can't, but you can inspire them to. But to do that, you have to be in your own inspiration. So one solid suggestion I would make is that if you haven't been inspired for a while by what you're doing, maybe it's time to regroup and look for the inspiration. And if it's not there, then you have decisions to make, right? The term heartsteading is one that I've taught my students. It has to do with bringing the right people together to solve difficult problems. I have a lot of faith in people's ability to do that. If you've got the right people in the room who care about the problem, they'll figure it out. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. I also wanted to mention, too, that the pyramid was inspired by Abraham Maslow's field work among the Blackfoot Indians. And in their way of holding this, personal and community actualization, meeting communal needs, and wisdom gathering, and also the practical on-the-ground work tend to go together instead of being separated. So a couple of quotations for you here. The first one is from a poet who is also an aviator and a war hero. Building a boat isn't about weaving canvas, forging nails, or reading the sky. It's about giving a shared taste for the sea. If you can do that, the rest will follow. And I do this at work. I've seen it happen in many different settings. If you can stay in your inspiration and coordinate other people's and help them articulate it, they'll figure out the details. And the second one, not authority, but aspiration, is the motivator, the builder and transformer of civilization. And that's Joseph Campbell. I'm not going to go through this right now, but it's some of the science on imagination. And again, you can have a copy of this slide if you want to see this. But what all these amount to is that imagination not only involves a lot of the brain, but it really comes online when we're working toward the future rather than staying stuck in the past. And here's another piece that I can't go into right now, but I did a little etymology, since that's what I like to do, on the name of this place. So if you look up John in a baby name dictionary, it'll usually say God is gracious, which is one layer. If you look a little deeper, though, there's a god called Oannes, an ancient Mesopotamian god. He looks like kind of a combination of a fish and a person. And he's actually a teacher of the arts of civilization, which I think is a little bit of what we're trying to do here with leadership. And then valleys, of course, are great places to go deep and to reflect. And snake, a great figure in many different mythologies of difficult transformation. So maybe those apply in terms of looking at this place through a mythic lens. Ecotherapy is part of one of the hats that I wear, and one of the powers, I think, of being an enchanted leader, getting people outside a bit instead of sitting in rooms all day. There's research on this that I can make available to you, but the gist of it is, even when we reconnect a little bit, it makes a huge difference to our health, our happiness, our sense of joy. There's people who do this to get over all kinds of, for instance, post-traumatic stress, assault victims. It's magical the degree to which nature connection can heal. And I think that's so important for this place in particular. So here's a loaded question. Which worldview? And this is the last thing I'll say is, this is a takeaway here. Leaders that can help us, this is what we need, to imagine not just what is, but how things could be. Because that's the pull. That's where the magic and the inspiration are. And people will topple empires or build them. They will redesign religions or found them. Businesses are founded on this. Just about everything in human affairs that counts comes back to somebody's fantasy about, wouldn't it be neat if this existed? All of these, by the way, are examples of fictional books that translate into real-world actions. So that one on the bottom, for instance, is a scene from Hunger Games. Thai activists are using the three-finger salute symbol out in the streets. Black Beauty changed the conditions of taxi drivers in London. So this is where fiction or fantasy change reality. Thank you. So at this point, I would like to ask Kelly Jones and William Morrow to come up so we can do our panel.